Hi everyone, welcome back to the class. This is chapter 5 on learning and adaptation. So remember last class when we talked about the big 3 types of learning. So in the last class we talked about habituation, and today we will talk about the second type, classical conditioning. Now classical conditioning is when two stimuli become associated with each other. So a quick example would be like a snake plus bite equals fear. So you see a snake, you get bit, and the outcome of that would be fear. So who came up with this? This idea was first created by Ivan Pavlov. So Pavlov's a big name that you probably recognize. And he is specialized in studying the digestive processes in animals. So in the process, he actually discovered classical conditioning, or what Pavlov referred to as conditioned reflexes. So really, this is just a great example of how accidents in science can make you famous, because he wasn't looking for this, but he found it. So how did Pavlov do this? So each morning, then a grad student would enter through a door with a bell on it, and then they would feed the dogs. And what he noticed was that the dogs would start to salivate when the students entered the room because the bell rang. So even before the food was presented. And so what Pavlov kind of concluded was that the sound of the bell elicited the salivation. So this process of association became known as classical or Pavlovian conditioning, where a form of learning in which a neutral stimulus comes to signal the occurrence of another stimulus. So when we're talking about the dogs, then that is the neutral stimulus would be the bell, comes to signal the occurrence of another stimulus. So that would be the food. So let's kind of break this down. So he decided to test his theory using dogs again and food, but instead of a bell, then he used a tuning fork. And so he would, at the beginning, then he'd, hit the tuning fork. He'd get this beautiful sound. And he looked at what the dogs did. And the dogs didn't really do much. Their ears might have perked up, but they didn't salivate. They didn't have a salivation response. Now, when he presented the dogs with food, then you did see salivation. So when he presented them with food, what we call this is an unconditioned stimulus. In other words, it's a stimulus that naturally produces a response. Okay, so it's unconditioned. You don't need to do anything, it's just there. So an unconditioned response is a response that's natural. So a natural response would be an unconditioned response. Now, during conditioning, okay, so this is during the training period, then what he would do is he would play the tone, he would hit that tuning fork at the same time as he presented the food to the dog. So when he did that, then the dog would still salivate, okay? And so the tuning fork is what we call a conditioned stimulus. So it is the stimulus we're using to condition learning. The food will always remain the unconditioned stimulus, okay? So the unconditioned stimulus never changes. Now, so the response during conditioning, then the response is still that unconditioned response because the food is still there. So because the food's there, the response is still unconditioned. However, when we're done conditioning, so this is like a testing phase, then what we can do is we can hit the tuning fork, and the tuning fork will make that beautiful sound. And remember, the tuning fork is the conditioned stimulus, so that sound. We're conditioning it. And because it's after training, then the dog will start to salivate. So now, because only the conditioned stimulus was present, then the response is now a conditioned response. Okay, so tuning fork is the conditioned stimulus, the food is the unconditioned stimulus, and the response depends on which stimulus is there. So if the unconditioned stimulus is there, the response is unconditioned response. If you only have a conditioned stimulus, then the response is a conditioned response. So now I gave you that example, and I kind of explained some of this terminology that we use, but I thought we'd break it down a little bit more and give some nice definitions. So the first one is the unconditioned stimulus. So this is a biologically significant stimulus that already has a response associated with it. So the example with the dog would be the food, right? So food is biologically significant, and then it already has a response associated with it. So that would be salivating. Another example, like remember I talked about the snake and bitten equals pain, then your biologically significant stimulus would be being bitten, being bitten. When you're bitten, it causes pain, right? So your biologically significant stimulus would be being bitten, and your natural response is pain. Now from that, then we go on to the conditioned stimulus. So this is something that used to be neutral. So we call that an NS, a neutral stimulus. And it comes to elicit a conditioned response. So it's something that used to be neutral, that didn't used to create a response. But now, over time, over training and learning, it now elicits a response. So when we're talking about the example with the dog again, then the tuning fork would be our conditioned stimulus, because before training, before conditioning, it was a neutral stimulus. Remember, we played the tuning fork and the dog didn't salivate. But after training and during training, then the tuning fork came to elicit the response of salivating. Okay. Now another example would be, again, let's go back to that snake example. So when you see a snake, the very first time, then seeing a snake shouldn't elicit any fear or, well, it shouldn't elicit any pain. It might elicit fear, but it wouldn't elicit pain, right? Because you're just seeing a snake. That doesn't hurt you. So that would be a neutral stimulus. However, if you've been bit even one time, or it could be a few times, after you've been conditioned, then now when you see a snake, your conditioned response would be you would feel the pain. Where that pain used to be associated with being bit, that pain is now being associated with just seeing the snake. So that's conditioned stimulus, okay? So now let's talk about the responses. Now remember, these responses, they are the same response, but it's whether it's associated with the US, the unconditioned stimulus, or the CS, the conditioned stimulus. So an unconditioned response is associated with a unconditioned stimulus, or the US, whereas a conditioned response happens when there's enough pairings of the conditioned stimulus plus the unconditioned stimulus, then eventually the conditioned stimulus will come to elicit the same response as the unpaired US. In other words, if CS plus US is big enough, then the CS The conditioned stimulus will now elicit a conditioned response. Okay, so you can really think of being able to understand it by what it's associated with, right? So unconditioned response is associated with unconditioned stimulus. Conditioned response is associated with a conditioned stimulus. Now, we have a few other terms that we talk about. So we have an association. So the association is the relationship between two stimuli. So that relationship between the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. We also have acquisition. So acquisition is the time period during which an association is being learned. So acquisition is the amount of time it takes for the neutral stimulus to turn into a conditioned stimulus. So let's go through a couple examples again. Okay, so this is the classical example of classical conditioning. So we're going to talk about this again. So over time, then we've got a neutral stimulus is the bell. Unconditioned stimulus is food. The unconditioned response is the dog salivates, or you can say licks their lips. So the dog's licking its lips because of the unconditioned response, because it sees food. So now what would happen if we only have the bell and the dog, right? So if we have a conditioned stimulus, what is the dog going to do? So this is if there's only one pairing. So immediately after, so say this happens one time. And then the second time, we just produce the bell. Is the dog going to respond? So the question here is, has acquisition occurred? Has the bell, the neutral stimulus, had enough time to become associated with the unconditioned stimulus? So in this example, probably not. But what happens if we do this 20 times? Okay, so we say we have a bell that we ring every time we present food, the dog salivates, and we do this 20 times. Now what happens? Well, because we've had enough time, we've had time for acquisition to occur, then now when we ring the bell, it's now a conditioned stimulus, and the dog will in fact produce our conditioned response. So when you ring the bell, the dog will start to salivate and lick its lips, right? And that's because enough time has occurred, because we've had enough acquisition so that the association between our neutral response, our neutral stimulus and our unconditioned stimulus have had time to build, and now our neutral stimulus is a conditioned stimulus. So let's stop here, and in the next video we will continue learning about classical conditioning.